Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Exciting times for us as what we kind of think of as talking season comes to an end, and what we think of as the actual season gets set to begin. Georgia reports for fall camp this week. We'll hear from Kirby Smart. The Dogs will be on the practice field. We'll start getting those practice reports. Like the 2025 season, folks, this is not a drill. It's essentially here. And in celebration of that, I want to give you, just for fun today, a few of the things that are being said about Georgia right now. All of it good. You'll like it all. That's good stuff. Jon Stinchcomb stops by today there as well. One of the things we'll talk to Jon about is kind of an interesting appraisal of the current landscape nationally where, hey, the race for a national championship here this season, which Georgia, we believe, very much a part of, more wide open perhaps than it's been in quite some time. We'll give you all the details on this, specifically how that relates to Georgia. That is coming up. So it's a fun show, great way to start the week. Glad to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Talking to a few folks in the chat before the show begins, pretty consistent theme emerges. The belief that football is essentially here, and in every way we sort of measure this, that is true. You've got NFL training camps. They have started. Preseason Hall of Fame game is Thursday. Am I right about that? So the NFL preseason games are essentially back. People like to do this thing where they say, hey, now no more weekends without football all the way through, January, because preseason football in the NFL, at least to a certain extent, counts on that. So that essentially begins. More important for our audience, Georgia training camp, fall camp, begins this week too. That means the Dogs will report. They'll be on the practice field, and the practice field means practice reports, whispers and rumors making their way to DawgNation.com. Our guy Connor Riley always does such a great job with that. We are very excited about all of that. And we'll also hear from Kirby Smart and some Georgia players here this week too, in an official capacity, now talking about the season that is kind of at our doorstep here. So football is essentially here, which means that what we kind of think of as talking season, that is now coming to an end. But before we officially put the so-called talking season to bed, can I give you a couple of things? All of this is fun. You're going to like all of it. And it relates to the Georgia defense. And as we do this, let's let our minds wander just for a moment. What if this is true? Like, what if at least some portion of some of the stuff I'm about to read to you, what if this does foreshadow the actual reality once the season begins? Let's think about what that could mean in terms of the positive for Georgia here this season. I think that's worth doing. In fact, we'll get ready to do that here right now. Let me start with this. Our friends at Pro Football Focus. Not everybody loves Pro Football Focus. Not everybody necessarily even understands what it is they do, the sort of scouting-based stuff that kind of comes with a light touch of the analytics and some of the math stuff. Not always easy to understand, but they've been doing this now for a while. They are a recognized resource for those who like thinking about and talking about football, and they recently ranked their top defenses for the upcoming season. And coming in at number 4 on the list of top defenses, not in the SEC, but in the entire country, was the University of Georgia, which to me seems pretty high for a team that, let's face it, wasn't great last year. I mean, they were good at times, and at times very good. The Texas game on the road, for instance, about as good as you can play, but not consistently at that level for the entire year. And even with that, they still lost 3 first-round picks off that defense. So the idea that a recognized, respected website like Pro Football Focus would have Georgia inside its top 4 for defenses for the upcoming season, I find that to be actually pretty notable. Let me read to you what Pro Football Focus says about Georgia. Even after losing 3 first-round picks from last year's defense, the Bulldogs still deserve a place in the top 5. Georgia has Pro Football Focus's number 4 linebacker unit, number 7 defensive line, and number 9 secondary entering the year. There are stars at every level, such as defensive tackle Christian Miller, linebacker C.J. Allen, and safety K.J. Bolden. The Bulldogs have the nation's best defensive mind and head coach Kirby Smart, who always seems to produce elite results on that side of the ball. So there you go. Pro Football Focus says it likes Georgia at every level of the defense. And if you'll remember, not surprising to hear that about the linebackers, of course. A little bit interesting on the secondary. But weeks ago, we made a big deal about the level of praise that Pro Football Focus had shown for Georgia's defensive line, because in particular, the biggest difference between the Georgia defenses in 2023 and 2024, teams that did not win the national championship, and those teams in 2021 and 2022 that did, was the overall play of the defensive line and the kind of measurable collection of talent at those positions. That's the biggest difference. And Pro Football Focus has, in its previous analysis, sort of suggested the Georgia defensive line could kind of be back to being, at least close to what it's been before, which makes it a little easier to understand why this could be a top 4 unit nationally. Once again, those are not my words, although I would certainly like for them to be true. That is Pro Football Focus based on its own evaluation, top 4 defense nationally. And I'm here to tell you, I will take that and run with it. If you told me right now, even though, the typical standard for Georgia to be the best at everything, if you told me right now Georgia could have the 4th best defense in America, would I take that to the bank and claim that right now as a prize? You better believe I would. Do you know how much better off Georgia would have been a year ago if it had the 4th best defense in America? Think about losses to Ole Miss and Alabama, where Dogs kind of yielded kind of a high point total. At least certainly a very high point total against Alabama and a high-ish total against Ole Miss. Slightly better play from the defense. How much could that have changed the fortunes a year ago? Well, Pro Football Focus seems to think top 4 here this year will at least take that somewhat seriously. And when you dive into more details about exactly why it is that Georgia could be that good defensively, let's turn to a different outlet here for a moment. The other day, ESPN was doing this piece online previewing the 2026 NFL draft, which is the next draft that will take place next April, at the various position groups debating this guy versus that guy as the top player off the board in that position. And when it came to inside linebacker, the name C.J. Allen came up, debating whether or not Allen could be the top inside linebacker drafted this upcoming April. And the guy he's being compared to is Hill, the linebacker from Texas. But I want to read to you what one scout in particular is quoted in saying in this. Now, no surprise, ESPN loves Anthony Hill because apparently Texas has to have the best of everything these days, despite the fact that Georgia beat them twice a year ago. But nonetheless, listen to what this one NFC South scout says about C.J. Allen. Here's the quote. "That dude does it all. He's so fast at reading and reacting. Allen is." Now, don't you love this? Listen to this. C.J. Allen is a wrecking ball. That is an NFC South scout, we're told by ESPN, saying that of C.J. Allen, not just as a guy succeeding in college football, but as a guy vying to be the first inside linebacker taken in the NFL draft, putting him in the same category of guys like Jalen Walker and Roquan Smith and Nakobe Dean, Quay Walker, the very best linebackers to come through this program. Allen kind of being mentioned in that category right now. So when you're trying to kind of make sense of, well, how could it be that Georgia is like a top 4 defense nationally, the way that Pro Football Focus suggests they will be, knowing they remain very strong at the area that's essentially been their top strength? Boy, that's really one of the ways in which that can happen, right? Because that Allen is just continuing the great legacy of inside linebacker play for Georgia. NFC South scout calling him a wrecking ball and describing all the things that he does. If you're a Georgia fan, once again, as we're kind of at the doorstep of the 2025 season beginning, that's just really fun to hear. But what if I told you that was not the highest level of praise out there for a Georgia defensive player here today? So, keeping in mind the Georgia defense is earning buzz ahead of the season. could be top 4 nationally. C.J. Allen could be the best linebacker in the sport. But what if a player that maybe you haven't had time to consider yet, what if that guy is not just even better than you imagine, but almost even better than everyone in the SEC? This is fascinating. Admittedly, it's a lot for me to kind of digest because it's a little bit out in front of what my expectations are, but I do like the analyst, so I will take this seriously. Perhaps you've seen this. Cole Kubelik, SEC Network analyst. We had a great conversation with Cole at SEC Media Days a couple of weeks ago. Cole, in some of his online stuff, his podcast, has recently made a prediction that the transfer from Army, Elo Modozie, will be the SEC's Player of the Year on the defensive side of the football. And if hearing me say that is a tremendous surprise to you, you can imagine how the rest of the country has reacted, those that care about this, to Kubelik saying what he has said. In fact, so much so that Cole felt the need to kind of go back online. I believe this was in an X video on the X platform, responding to those who had been surprised that Cole believed that Elo Modozie would be the defensive player of the year. And in discussing this, listen to the category, for those of you that care a lot about SEC football and know the top names within the SEC beyond just Georgia, listen to the kind of category of player that Cole right now wants to put Elo Modozie in. Y'all, this is wild. Cole Kubelik from social media on the recent Georgia transfer.
Some folks may be not happy about who I picked as my SEC Defensive Player of the Year this season. He's in Athens, Georgia. It's just not the guy that you normally would talk about in Athens, Georgia, because it's Elo Modozie, which I thought it was Elo. I was pronouncing it incorrectly, apparently. Elo Modozie. This is a guy that in his career has 43 tackles, 9 tackles for loss, 7.5 sacks. Also returned a punt for touchdown in 2023. But has some of the best just bend and flexibility off the edge that I've seen the last couple of years in college football. Now, Dylan Stewart's got it too, but like Dylan Stewart's is a different guy. I think when you take everything that's going to be around Modozie in that Georgia defense and you bring his twitch, his speed, his get off, his flexibility, put his motor there, the way he plays, if he's 8 to 12 pounds heavier than he was last year, watch the F out is all I'm saying. Because this kid's explosive. He's twitchy. He's fast. He's got great understanding of pass rush moves, counter moves, setup moves.
That's wild, right? I mean, that's really aggressive praise for Elo Modozie right there. And a couple of things. Thing number one is my sources have told me, to the extent that I have sources, my sources have told me that it is pronounced Elo Modozie. So Cole is correct on that. Not Elo, the way that phonetically it might look, but Elo Modozie is what we're going with there on that. But to get back to the main point at hand, y'all, did you see Dylan Stewart for South Carolina a year ago? Did you see what Stewart did for the Gamecocks? Stewart, I would say on paper this season, is probably the best returning defensive player in the SEC. He, along with Lenore Sellers, the two big reasons why South Carolina is considered to be a playoff contender. And Cole Kubelik mentions Elo Modozie right there in the same category of Dylan Stewart. That's how good Cole Kubelik thinks Elo Modozie can be, sort of a Dylan Stewart comparison, which is wild. More from Cole on that topic.
This Modozie kid is one you need to know. Transfer from Army to the Georgia defense that is absolutely going to be ripping off the edge. I don't think physically they have another guy like him. And think about that when we're talking about Georgia's defense, the athletes, the talent, the 5 stars that they have all over the place, the way this young man moves, changes direction, twitch, bends, uses his arms, the length he has with all that speed. I just don't think Georgia has another guy like this. They got some great guys. They got some good guys. I love Gabe Harris. I love some of the other guys up front. This dude's different. I'm just telling you. And could Raylan Wilson end up being the guy in that defense and take it all and be defensive player of the year? Sure. KJ Bolden? Sure. Could. There's something about this dude and the way he plays and the way he moves that right now I'm going there.
What a prediction from Cole Kubelik. And it probably, if you're like me, makes you want to, and we've heard some version of this a lot throughout the offseason. So this is not necessarily brand new. Elo is a guy that's generated a lot of buzz. But to hear Kubelik, who's on TV, a respected voice, to hear him be as emphatic about that as he is, that caused me to kind of raise my eyebrow a little bit more. It makes me want to consider a little bit more about what Modozie is perhaps bringing to the Georgia program. So with that in mind, other day, a guy we also just mentioned, C.J. Allen, was with Georgia in the contention from the Dogs at SEC Media Days. Our Connor Riley caught up with C.J. and talked to him about a number of topics. You can see the full video interview online on our DawgNation YouTube page. But in particular, one of the things that did come up was what he has seen from Elo Modozie. So in light of Cole Kubelik predicting Modozie to be the SEC's Defensive Player of the Year, here's what C.J. Allen told our Connor Riley he has seen from Modozie thus far.
I think Elo's just a great person. He wants to get better. He wants to learn the defense. And he wants to win. So I think that's his biggest thing is coming here. Being able to learn. So I think him being able to come here and learn the defense is huge for him.
We so often hear Georgia's not for everybody. How has he handled, I think, sort of the transition, especially coming from a program like Army, which has its own sort of standard and tradition?
No doubt, like you said, coming to Army is kind of a great thing right there. But I think him just coming along, any guy that come in here, just embrace it as a brotherhood. When you choose Georgia, you choose something bigger than yourself. So I think this kind of speaks for itself.
So there you hear C.J. Allen saying, hey, for a guy that comes from Army, high standard, they're asking a lot from their players. These are guys that kind of go on to be like not just, NFL necessarily, but like chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or something like that, like the United States Military Academy. Pretty significant history when it comes to that sort of thing. We talked to our guy, Davin Bellamy, about that the other day. Davin had some interesting things to say about Elo Modozie, and it's worth going back to Wednesday's show last week to hear more on that. But Allen there saying, I'm impressed with the standard. I'm impressed with the way he's embraced the brotherhood, knowing that Georgia football is about something that's greater than yourself because it existed before you got here. It'll still exist after you're gone. That's what it means to commit to Georgia football. And a guy like Allen, who plays the highest level, believes right there that Modozie is pretty clearly capable of doing all of that too. So let me kind of sum all of this up this way. It's obviously pretty aggressive to say that Elo Modozie is the SEC's Defensive Player of the Year. Maybe Cole Kubelik ends up not being right about that. But even if he's off by even 50%, right? Even if he's off by a lot, it still suggests that Modozie has a chance to be a really strong contributor for Georgia at a position where they need a strong contribution, and they do need some new blood to step up. Even if he's not SEC Defensive Player of the Year, certainly sounds possible that he could fill the need that Georgia has. And C.J. Allen, will he be the top drafted linebacker this upcoming April? Well, history would suggest with Georgia there's a very good chance that he will be. But even if that's not quite what happens, he is still going to be one of the very best players in the country on that side of the ball, and we believe that Georgia will be very glad to have him. And maybe Georgia really will be, as Pro Football Focus suggests, the fourth best defense in America. Maybe they're even better than that. But what if they're not quite that good? But what if they're just sort of back at like a top 10 level again, a top 15 level again, probably slightly below that the last couple of years? What if they're just sort of back to being that? Well, everything else on the offensive side of the ball, getting better with your offensive line, finding more running game, establishing a first-time full-season starting quarterback, all of that gets way easier if the defense is playing the way in which these voices are suggesting that it could. So these are kind of the final remnants of the sort of leftover hype from talking season. And a lot of it's not worth much more than just taking some time to enjoy. But on this show, we like taking some time to enjoy folks saying good stuff about Georgia. And as the natural excitement starts to build for the fact that the season's almost here, let your imagination also run wild a bit too, that these Georgia Bulldogs could be back to being dominant on defense. that's the case, that means the fall could be even more fun than we were maybe already thinking. My name's Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We're happy that you're with us. No matter how you get to us, video, it's 10 a.m., radio, Athens Sports Radio 96 The Rep, podcast, Apple, Spotify, everything else. Just glad you were with us. And a big thanks to our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia who make it all possible. Y'all, it is as hot as ever here right now. So much so that if you're like me, you're trying to keep all the sunshine from coming inside your house as much as you possibly can because, let's face it, AC's already working overdrive like all the time. The last thing you want is that to be, even more intense than it already is. So you get the blinds closed, you get the curtains pulled, you got everything that's trying to keep your house as cool as it possibly can right now. But if you really wanted to do the absolute best you could to make your home as comfortable as possible during these extreme sort of heat moments of the year, well, the best way to do all of that is by getting that window upgrade from our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Because the technology they have available to them and can make accessible for you, well, it's going to make your house feel better on the inside. Even when it's like unmercifully hot on the outside, your home can be cool and comfortable because that AC that you've got on, that you pay so much for, it's not escaping out of your house because of poorly fitted or inefficient or just kind of sort of beyond their shelf life windows. No, when you take the best possible care of your home by getting that great window upgrade, you're going to make your home feel better on the inside. And I tell you, windows are one of those things that honestly you probably don't think that much about them unless you need new windows, because let's face it, the whole purpose of a window, you sort of see through it. That means you don't necessarily see it. You sort of see what's on the other side of that window. But when you really do think about the window goes a long way towards how your home looks on the outside. If you've ever driven by and you've seen just kind of, what it looks like when the windows are just, you can just sort of tell when the windows aren't quite right. You can see it from the outside, but you can also tell if, various zones in your house. This feels kind of cool. This doesn't quite feel so cool. In the wintertime, it kind of shows up as a draft. Well, listen, all of those like things where certain parts of your house just don't quite feel as good as other parts of your house, all of that can be corrected with the window upgrade, the likes of which that Pella Window and Door provides. In many cases, you're talking about, windows that have the shades and the blinds and things like that built into them. If you haven't stopped to think about window technology in a while, you'll be really impressed with what Pella has available to you. So it's worth the consultation with one of those Pella experts. They're not going to push you towards anything. They're simply going to educate you on why the great homeowners in our area are providing this necessary upgrade to their home. So find online, PellaGA.com/DawgNation. That website, once again, PellaGA.com/DawgNation. You can also give them a call, 678-638-1429. That's 678-638-1429. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is going beyond. Okay, so we've got Jon Stinchcomb coming up. That's going to be a lot of fun. We also have the potential for some breaking news in college football later on today. We're following that closely. I will tell you what that is outside of the SEC here coming up in just a couple of minutes. But before anything else, let me take a moment to remind you of what we announced on Friday, really thrilling news as it relates to our DawgNation invasion. So a lot of you know one of the big events we did a couple of years ago was our DawgNation invasion on the Tennessee River. It was a great experience, really one of the best DawgNation events we'd really ever done, where we took folks, on that riverboat. The Tennessee River is beautiful. Knoxville's, whatever. But the Tennessee River is clearly the best part of Knoxville. And we sort of rode our riverboat filled with DawgNation people, decked out in DawgNation colors, really kind of flying our flag that day, so much so that the SEC network saw it, took notice. They put us on their TV that day. Tennessee fans were beside themselves. It ended up being a dominant win for Georgia on the field, spoiling Dolly Parton being there and everything else. It was a great day to be a Georgia fan. One of the best moments of that 2023 season. So much so that the demand we've heard from hundreds of you is, BA, y'all have got to do that again. Well, I'm here and proud to announce we are doing it again for the 2025 season. However, what's different is, let's think logistics here for a moment. The last time in 2023, this game was in November. As you know, this year, the game is in September. That means you've got to make your plans now to be a part of our Dog Nation invasion. It is time now to get locked in, to get ready for all of this. We want to see you as a part of it. So please take this website down. We can put that back on the screen here for a minute so I can read this. It's DawgNation.com/tailgate/Tennessee. One more time on this. DawgNation.com/tailgate/Tennessee. You can click the link there, be a part of this, find out all the great features and benefits of this great event, the food, the bar on board, the Dog Nation swag. There is so much fun stuff, including a great buffet and a great, bar experience. All of that for you on our Dog Nation invasion on the Tennessee River, the gorgeous riverboat, kind of setting sail and seeing, the side of perhaps that part of East Tennessee that you've never seen before. Gorgeous views of the river, fun to watch all those Tennessee fans from the land kind of looking over and not liking what they see from us, but letting them know that the Dogs have been dominant in that series. We plan on staying dominant for a long time to come, including dominating the tailgate as well with our Dog Nation invasion. So one more time on that, DawgNation.com/tailgate/Tennessee for a lot more on that today. Okay, so that's coming up. Hope to see you there. Before we get Jon Stinchcomb, let's also get ready to go around the DawgHouse here right now, poured by our friends at Dr. Pepper. And one of the things that I should do a little better job of than I do, listen, I'm a man who has strengths and weaknesses, and one of the weaknesses I try to correct sometimes is when we have great guests on, maybe I should try to ask shorter questions, because historically speaking, when you ask shorter questions, you oftentimes get better answers. Now, I can't shut up, as many of you know, so asking shorter questions, not always the easiest thing for me to do. But I thought there was a really good example of what I'm describing there in an interview that I recently conducted with Georgia quarterback Gunner Stockton. Right as we were getting ready to say goodbye to Gunner, I asked him a very simple question of, do you have any goals for the upcoming season? And sometimes when you just sort of shut up and lay out, you let the other person have their time to talk. And even for someone like Gunner, who's a little mild-mannered, who's not exactly the hot takiest of quarterbacks, when you give him some space to speak, sometimes they'll say something kind of interesting. And I thought when I asked that relatively simple question to Gunner, even though Gunner's not the most bombastic quote out there, I did think the Gunner said something pretty interesting in response to that. So here around the DawgHouse, poured by Dr. Pepper, listen to this exchange I had with Gunner Stockton going back to SEC Media Days. Do you have a goal for yourself or your team this year?
I think obviously at Georgia you want to win every game, and that's the best thing about being at Georgia. That's the standard. So that's the privilege, and I look forward to just enjoying every moment with the guys and just embracing it.
So, simple question, not exactly a bombastic answer, but let's think about what Gunner said right there for a moment. You have any goals? He says, obviously at Georgia, you want to win every game. And to dive into that here just for a moment, is that still obviously true? Both because of a prevailing belief around some nationally that somehow the talent level at Georgia is perhaps regressed, that Georgia isn't what it once was. Some saying Georgia isn't what it once was because of Gunner Stockton. Is it still obviously true that Georgia expects to win every game? Or to look at it from a different way, is it, to use Gunner's word, obviously true that Georgia's goal is to win every game given the schedule that Georgia plays? We've told you before, those that act like the Georgia schedule for this season is somehow far easier because games like Texas and Alabama are now at home. I think they're misunderstanding that there's real expectations for improvement among Auburn, Florida, those teams that have kind of been considered the quote-unquote easy games for Georgia in recent years. There are people out there who believe those games might not be quite so easy here this season. So given how tough the Georgia schedule appears to be on paper, is it still obviously true that Georgia could win every game? Is that still a realistic goal for UGA? Gunner's not predicting that's what Georgia will do. He's not Joe Namath here to date myself with a reference, but he is certainly suggesting that is still the mission that Georgia's trying to go on, which I do think is interesting. And I would say, in response to those who don't believe that's possible because of what they think that Georgia has kind of become here in 2025 because of transfer portal and all the other stuff that goes on, maybe it's appropriate to give some larger context about the rest of college football here just for a moment. You may know who Bud Elliott is. Bud's a guy that we cited. We'll cite him from time to time on the show, but certainly this time every year because he does the blue chip ratio, the percentage of former 4- and 5-star prospects who become, who help teams win the national championship. This is not related to the blue chip ratio, but that's what Bud is sort of known for. He's kind of a guy that likes the numbers and things like that. He put a post up on X the other day that I thought was really interesting. Let me show this on the screen here for a moment. Now, the chart, I don't read charts particularly well, so this may not mean much to you. It doesn't mean much to me, but I want to give you his words here. Bud writes on X, this goes back to Saturday. He asks, is the portal, NIL, and all the 24-year-old COVID quarterbacks cycling out of college football making the sport more balanced or uncertain? He says it's been a decade since we've had the national title favorite have odds of plus 500 or higher. And when you think plus 500, I want you to think 5-1, okay? It's a little bit easier to understand it sometimes in that kind of context of 5-1. And Bud, with his chart here, shows you that this year, the two top title favorites, that'd be Texas and Ohio State, they are both in that kind of 5-1, just below 6-1 range. Compare that to a year ago when the top favorites were in like the 3 to 4-1 range. So this year, there is less of an overwhelming favorite than there was a year ago. Compare that to 2023, when, unfortunately, in that case, it would have been Georgia in that kind of, 2-1 to slightly less than 3-1 range. In 2022, you had a team, that would have been Alabama for that particular year. It was like less than 2-1 to win the title. There were two others that would have been Georgia and Ohio State, less than 4-1. So what you see over the course of kind of this era for Georgia, in which they've been, a legitimate championship contender, is that the top contenders are just less of an overwhelming favorite than they once were. This year, it's that sort of 5-1, 6-1 type range. So let me give you just sort of a simple point to kind of tell you what I think this should mean to you. Is that when you look at Georgia, it perhaps seems like Georgia is less than what it once was. We just did a whole thing about that related to the Georgia defense. It perhaps looks like Georgia is less than it once was. And measurably, based on its national title odds, that seemed to be somewhat true. But the context here is that the other top contenders, compared to previous top contenders, they are, as Bud Elliott points out, also less than they once were too. That this is a sport that is, to a degree, slightly more wide open than it's been in the past. And I mean slightly. You can still list the top national title contenders on one hand, but they are less overwhelming than they perhaps were even just a couple of years ago. Important context to remember when we evaluate what Georgia might be for this season. That's also around the DawgHouse, poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. And I love the rich, one-of-a-kind flavor of Dr. Pepper, especially when it's so hot outside. It's that thing I just look forward to and enjoy. In fact, right before the show began, went and put a couple of Dr. Peppers right there in that refrigerator so they'd be waiting for me right when the show is over. I like to keep them super cold. I like to feel the cold, is it aluminum? Is that what it is? The cold aluminum in my hand when the show is over. That's my trigger that I'm about to enjoy a sweet, succulent treat. The reason why I say succulent, that's not a word I typically use, but it's a part of the video that we show right there. That's what Dr. Pepper is all about for me. So I love the Diet Dr. Pepper, but a lot of folks are loving this brand new Dr. Pepper Blackberry and Dr. Pepper Blackberry Zero Sugar. Folks are also loving all the other fun stuff going with Dr. Pepper here right now. So whether it's the Blackberry Zero Sugar, or one of the Dr. Pepper flavors for which it's been famous for, make sure you check out the rich, one-of-a-kind flavor of Dr. Pepper today, and it's great to have Dr. Pepper pouring around the DawgHouse to us here today. All right, without further ado, let's have a fun conversation. The great former Georgia All-American, always a special time for us on a Monday. Let's talk to Jon Stinchcomb right now, DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Say hello to Jon Stinchcomb. It's a pleasure to speak to him as always. And John, I want to get into what I was just discussing. Whether you care about the odds or even kind of know how the odds are tabulated, according to people who watch this stuff closely, hey, the level of favorite that this year's top national title favorites are is less than it would have been in previous years. Does that match what you think your naked eye would lead you to believe?
Yeah, and I think it's all due to the parity that NIL's created. Now you see a number of teams that have legitimate chances, and I don't think we quite see the pooling of talent that existed in the early 2010s, where you were able to kind of create these super teams. And I think because of the direction of NIL and these elite teams able to recruit in a way that makes it a little more competitive, now we're seeing 5, 6, 8 teams that when you start the year, they all have a legit claim to have a run at the title.
Can I break the fourth wall here just for a second? This is a small thing, but I do want to say this. Your microphone sounds amazing. Like you went on vacation, you came back. Last couple of weeks, I'm talking about like Marconi Award level audio coming from Casa de Stinchcomb. So I just want to say thank you for just the high quality of, it is really a sterling sound that you are producing. And I just wanted to say thank you for that. I know the audience appreciates that too. Like you really, really sound beautiful.
Well, the credit goes to producer Jay Black because he was letting me know how bad my AirPods had gotten. And so I went out and invested in a little microphone to kind of help the quality and distract you from at least having to look at my face. Maybe it makes my voice sound just a little bit better.
Well, I would never say it sounded bad. I'm just saying it sounds beautiful here right now, and I certainly appreciate that. So let's take what you just said and then kind of apply that to Georgia, because I think that context is always really important. And we could do a show talking about all the things that are good about Georgia. We never run out of stuff to talk about. We could also, sometimes we do, spend all of our time talking about all the big questions that Georgia has and all the potential stumbling blocks that could prevent them from having great success, and on and on and on you go. And we would sort of never run out of those kinds of issues either, right? And so I do think for Georgia fans, and I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong, I'm saying when you get fixated on, what about the offensive line? Or, what about the running game? Or, what about the new quarterback? Or, what about the whatever? I think it's important to know that all of this comes within the context of, hey, nobody is quite what they once were even a couple of years ago, and everybody is probably slightly reliant on at least a little bit of a luck. You got to have a ball break your way at some point in time in the season, in a way that if you're 2021, 2022 Georgia, or some of these sort of super teams around that, even if you kind of had bad luck befall you, you were still going to just kind of plow right through just because you had so much talent. Well, now everybody's slightly more vulnerable than they were in the past, which means that maybe our appraisal of Georgia should be a little bit more generous, just kind of given the larger context around college football.
Yeah, I think it's depth. I think that's the biggest change. You look at these top teams, and I still include Georgia in that conversation. There used to be 3 deep, and think of George Pickens last year, where he missed a majority of that season, but yet you didn't see as much of a significant drop-off as you'd expect when a player of his caliber is unavailable. And I think that's because you were 3 deep across the board, and that just doesn't exist anywhere. Recruiting is still the biggest factor. You have to have the best players come to your campus. But as Coach Smart was talking about at SEC Media Days, it makes your team a little bit younger because guys that don't find that success early on are transferring out into different opportunities. And Georgia has certainly seen a number of those cases where players didn't immediately matriculate to the top, and now they're playing for competitors, whether it's, Missouri seems to be a hot landing spot or others. There's been a number of guys that maybe at this point in their career would have been more of a factor and contributors at Georgia, but yet they're out the door. And for those high-end, top-end players, it's gotten competitive. Texas, Ohio State, They have deep pockets and a great program. And so the leverage that Georgia had in the past of being able to recruit players, keep them as a part of a program, and not worry that 2 years down the road they might be somewhere else. That just doesn't exist anymore. It's not crying over spilt milk. Every team's dealing with that. But I think it also makes that top 10 tier more competitive because, Texas can't sustain that. Ohio State can't sustain that. Georgia can't sustain that. If you have a spate of injuries or players that you're counting on that may not play at that level, you're going to feel it.
So let's do something fun here for a minute, or at least this is fun for me. I don't know if it's fun for you or not, but it's one of my favorite things doing sports talk. So if we would say that, okay, well, you've got a team like Texas who spent, we're led to believe, just tens of millions of dollars to put their roster together. They haven't really broken through and won a championship under Steve Sarkisian. It's been 20 years since they've won a national title at all. Then I think it's reasonable to say national championship or bust for Texas here this season. Ohio State just won last year's national championship. You might even say,
which is where they were, BA, right? I mean, that last year it was championship or bust for Ohio State. And
that's right.
For them, that they were able to come home with it. But I think that same standard applies to Texas at this point. So sorry to interrupt, but that's a great point.
No, I think you're right. Yeah, national championship bust. Probably, maybe even Ohio State is that way again, just because, hey, well, if we won it last year, why not try to win it again this year? Maybe they are championship or bust. We have gotten used to a world in which Georgia is national championship or bust because they won in 21, they won in 2022. They were the overwhelming favorite in 2023, came up just a little bit short. But given the fact that, the odds aren't quite what they were, Georgia's not going to be the preseason number one team, let's try to define success for Georgia here for a moment. Do you think that Georgia is still national championship or bust, or do you think something less than a national championship season could be considered a success for these Bulldogs here in this year?
Isn't that wild, BA? We've gotten to the point where it's, if they don't win a national championship, can we still consider the season a success? What an awesome place to be.
Yeah.
Flashback 5 years ago, and if you said we're going to have this conversation where we're going to contemplate if Georgia falls short of a national title and is able to be SEC champions and make a deep run into the college football playoffs, would that still be considered a success? What if they beat a number of these teams? And we've talked about this on the show before as well. It's a tough calendar. You look at the schedule and it's not filled with a bunch of cupcakes. There's a lot of, really marquee games that are going to have national impacts across the stage. And you're going, it's a cool place to be. I'm glad we're here. With that said, last year, Georgia won an SEC championship, didn't play to the standard that we've come to anticipate. And I don't know that they hit the mark. I think that because the bar has been risen so high, it's been raised to the point where the expectation is Georgia's going to compete for a national championship on an annual basis, that's the standard. And so I think you have to win most of the big games in the regular season. I love the quote from Gunner that you played right before I came on, that the expectation is you win every game. I don't care who your competitor is. But you got to win an SEC championship. You got to make a run into the playoffs. You got to win a lot of those big games in the middle of the season for this to be considered a successful season. But the standard that Coach Smart and his entire program has risen the expectations to is we're going to compete for a national championship on an annual basis.
So I have two other issues I want to talk to you about, but let me just kind of follow up on this because I think this is interesting. So, when I look at college football overall, there's a lot not to like right now, maybe about this expanded playoff. It didn't quite work out last year the way that I think everybody wanted it to, but I think one of the things that's undeniably good about the expanded playoff is I do think it makes success a little easier to define in a way that in college basketball, advancing deeper into the NCAA tournament is a good way to understand sort of how you did one year compared to the other. In a 14 playoff world, it's sort of binary. You either made the playoff or you didn't, either won the national title or you didn't. And that means a lot of teams are left kind of wondering, well, how good were we really if we didn't do one of these things that only kind of sort of exist for a narrow sliver of the sport? In an expanded playoff world, I think it's easier to measure. So my point that I'm getting to is this, is that for me, success for Georgia could be defined simply as just advancing further in this year's playoff than it did in the previous year's playoff. Georgia made the 12-team playoff a year ago, but did not win a game in the playoff. If it somehow is playing in the semifinals this year, even if it doesn't advance beyond that, it would be hard for me to call that season a failure for Georgia. But I do think to be a success, you got to take a step further than the one that you took in 2024. Does that seem fair?
Sure. And the model has changed, right? Across all of college football, it used to be if you don't go undefeated or on a lucky year, you have one loss, then it's not going to be a successful campaign because you're not going to have a shot at the national championship. And because the expansion of the college football playoffs, because the schedule has changed and now you have more meaningful games in the season, which is a good thing for all of us, the expectation and what you can consider a success has changed. It needs to evolve. It needs to go past. I think that's a great metric. The fact that the old adage is it's hard to make it to the top, it's even harder to stay there. There's a reason why that's a saying. And when Georgia has raised the bar again to the point where you got to be competing for a national championship, if we were in that different scenario, if this is flashback to 10 years ago and Coach Smart just comes to campus, it's we want to be a part of the SEC championship conversation and play into the college football playoffs, especially now that it's expanded. So I think that standard of those two things, but making a deeper run still exists. I think that's where Georgia's at. They need to be a part of that national championship run, and they need to win some of those games in postseason play, which means that they have to make it there. And with the expansion, that should be easily accomplished. I don't know about easily accomplished, but more accessible than it ever has been. Even with the consideration of a tougher slate of games in the regular season.
So before you joined us, kind of gave a hodgepodge of Pro Football Focus says Georgia top 4 defense nationally. ESPN suggests highest drafted linebacker. Cole Kublik suggests defensive player of the year coming from a unit, and a lot of our audience might not even be fully acquainted with who that even is. Elo Modozie essentially just got here from Army. And the point that I made earlier is, John, some of that may be a little out in front of where I am right now, but even if a portion of that comes true, this could be an upgraded defense this year over what it was in 2023 and 2024. And the idea of advancing further this season than you did a year ago, how much easier does that become if even some of what we're hearing about the Georgia defense right now ends up being true?
Yeah, we've entered the season of hot takes, right? Because we haven't seen a single snap of football played this year, and it's all projection and possibilities. And 3 weeks ago, we're talking about how Georgia was left off all of the All-American lists and what the implications are there. And now there's others that have identified individual players, whether it's C.J. Allen or otherwise. Modozie, what's he going to look like in red and black? All points of excitement, and that's a good thing. We want to be a part of those discussions, especially talking about individual performances, because if you're going to be competing, if we're going to meet that list of what it means and definition of success, you're going to have to hit on some of those things. I think you're exactly right, but it's pure speculation. We don't know what Zachariah Branch, who swept all of the special teams awards preseason, what that looks like when he's wearing red and black and he's got a G on the side of his helmet. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of excitement there. I think there needs to be. I think there's going to be hits and misses. You look and say, oh, we didn't see that coming. Could be a really good thing just because of the roster that Georgia has with some players that are having to step in because guys are now playing in the NFL. So hopefully there are more hits, but right now it's the season of hot takes where anybody can say just about anything, and very rarely come December and January are we going to look back and say, "Ooh, you missed those," or
Right.
"You hit on these." Although some folks will obviously have selective memory and only claim the hot takes that they have this time of year that hit, and totally disregard the other misses that I'm sure are rampant across all platforms this time of year.
I think that's true. Let me finish with this. So Georgia will officially start fall camp this week. They'll report. Kirby Smart will speak. Practice will begin. We'll hear some practice reports. The sense that I get from NFL players, and of course you were one of those, they by and large hate training camp. Veteran players just hate it, count down the moments until it's over. It's kind of, I think they would say, sort of beneath them because they're veterans. They know what they're doing. This training camp is just, it's hot. Falcons players got in fights this weekend. It's just one of those things where nobody likes training camp. Do college players sort of feel the same way, or after a long summer of workouts and stuff that, closely approximates football but not quite? Sometimes the sense I get from the younger guys is, hey, at least this is better than what we have been doing. Not better, but maybe just a little bit of a higher level of enthusiasm for fall camp than maybe what the pro guys have. Like, what's the vibe around a team like Georgia like at the college level as it gets ready to begin fall camp?
Well, I will say across all levels, in high school now, and certainly college and the NFL, the grind is year round. So to have a shifting of gears is welcomed, even if training camp stinks at every level. But I think collegiately specifically, talking about college guys, the opportunity to get better, the opportunity to compete, the opportunity to win jobs exist in more places than it does in the NFL. For most of those rosters, you've got a pretty good idea of who's going to be where and which individual folks can have some slight additive properties to the roster. For college, you look across the board, there's opportunities that exist. This Georgia team, there are so many different places where you're like, there's exciting battles here. There's exciting battles even for the quarterback position where, we all think it's going to be Gunner, but with Ryan coming in, maybe there's more competition there. Certainly that's the case for the offensive line or defensive line or wide receivers. How about the cornerbacks? I mean, across the board for Georgia, they're no exception. There's opportunities for guys to compete. There's expectations that, despite the fact that the name on the back of the jersey and the number stays the same, that this player is different come August 2025 than they were last year. And that's because we're talking about guys that are 18 to 22 years old, and they're continuing to develop and change and get better and stronger and faster and smarter and understand technique better. So I think because of those reasons, training camp is held in a different regard, even for some of the veterans. They know that a veteran is still 21, 22 years old and is still looking at this of, man, I haven't mastered my craft yet. There's so much of this that I can get better at, and I can't wait to get out there and show it.
Jon, great stuff. Always appreciate your insight, especially given the fact that you've been through all this as a player. You know what it's like to thrive and succeed in these intense environments. We certainly appreciate that on our show today. Hope you have a great week, and the next time we speak, we'll be speaking about what is actually happening on Georgia's practice field as the season will essentially kind of be upon us there at that moment. So look forward to that. Jon, always appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it, BA. Go Dogs.
Go Dogs indeed.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So I asked this to Jon. I'll ask it to all of you. And this is one of those things where I do think it's reasonable for Georgia fans to perhaps have a slightly different point of view on this. Me saying to Jon that I think, given the landscape of college football, how wide open it perhaps is, given what we think we know about Georgia right now, that perhaps you could have a expectation for success here this season below winning the national championship. That I don't think that Georgia could come out and replicate exactly what it did a year ago and have folks treat that like a success. I don't think. If it repeats as SEC champions, I think that kind of gets interesting. But the way a lot of this is measured is by how far you advance the college football playoff. And if Georgia's, after having been to the playoff a year ago, playing as a bye in the quarterfinals, if it's not in the semifinals this year, I think a lot of people will view that as, less than successful. Do you think that's fair? Or some of you are going to be like, well, BA, you're not holding them to a high enough standard, that this is still, within this decade, a two-time national champion, within the last couple of years, a two-time national champion. So therefore, it is national championship or bust. I think for some Georgia fans, there could be an argument to be made for that. I won't pretend to have, the monopoly on the correct opinion when it comes to this particular topic. But John was asked that. He weighed in. If you want to weigh in with me, I'd love to hear from you at DawgNation Daily on the X platform. Perhaps the best and easiest way to do that. Now, let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean here for a moment. And let's get you excited about a lot of great things going on with Royal Caribbean here right now. We are literally just a couple of weeks away from the debut of Star of the Seas, this brand new addition to the Icon class of ships. When Icon of the Seas debuted not all that long ago, it was the true game changer in the cruise space. And listen, I love Icon of the Seas. It was amazing. I was lucky enough to go down to the port of Miami and sail on Icon of the Seas. It was literally an experience I'll never forget, both because of the sheer size of Icon, but also the really cool new things that Icon of the Seas introduced to the cruise vacation space. And yet, as excited as I was about Icon, I can tell you, I'm even more excited about Star of the Seas for the simple point that Star of the Seas was made to sail out of what I think of as my home port. I live here in Georgia. The easiest cruise port for me to get to is Port Canaveral. That's the port that I can drive to. I appreciate the chance to drive when I can. And the thing that Port Canaveral is now the home to a ship like Star of the Seas is just amazing. The commitment that Royal Caribbean has made to Port Canaveral to put its newest, its biggest, I would say its best ships, boy, what an awesome thing that is. So as you're planning your vacation experiences for this fall and into 2026, even thinking about next spring, next summer, I want you to think about the introduction of Star of the Seas to the cruise space here at Port Canaveral from our friends at Royal Caribbean. In fact, you can give Jessica Slater, a wonderful travel advisor, a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. You can check that out today. All right, let's go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Let's get you a couple of stories here right now. Starting with, earlier I talked about Georgia being ranked number 4 preseason defense by Pro Football Focus. Fair and balanced here. We should point out that the unit that came in at number 1 on this list is Alabama. Texas is also at number 2. Let's talk Bama here for a moment. I am steadfastly of the belief that for all the attention that Texas gets as a Georgia opponent, that on paper, I don't really see any reason. Obviously, the arch, comparison with the Alabama unknown quarterback situation is going to come up. I don't really see any reason, though, why Alabama in September isn't at least as difficult, if not more so, at least as difficult for Georgia as the game against Texas in November. Y'all, I don't take great pleasure in saying this, but I do think, a little bit like some of us perceive Georgia to be, I think that Alabama comes into this upcoming season slightly undervalued, better than they are being given credit for. And I think the defensive side of the ball is a big reason why. This is a unit right now. LT Overton's the name but there are top guys in the secondary. This is a group that's very, very good. They are overshadowed by the attention that Ryan Williams gets as wide receiver, the unknown situation at quarterback. They're overshadowed by some of that, the new offensive coordinator hire. But it's a Bama defense that could be pretty good. And I think that's important to keep in mind when you think about, hey, the tough games that Georgia's going to play, for all the hype the atmosphere is going to get, and it's going to be amazing for Georgia against Alabama. It is also, we think, going to be a knockdown, drag-out of a football game. Let me also make one more kind of point on this particular story, then I'll move on. What if it's true that Bama, Texas, Georgia, these are all top 4 defensive nationally? Doesn't that pair well with what we're also being told is kind of a year of the quarterback in the SEC in many respects. Lenore Sellers, DJ Lagway, Garrett Nussmeyers. In some form or fashion, Arch Manning's a part of that, even if it's too much hype right now. Gunner Stockton may prove to be a part of that. There are some very good quarterbacks on paper in the SEC, but an outlet like Pro Football Focus would suggest there are also some of the country's best defenses too. The chess match between coach and teams when top-flight quarterback plays against top-flight defense, boy, that can make the SEC a lot of fun here this year. Let me shift to something a little bit more serious. Today, we're expecting to hear from Colorado coach Deion Sanders, and what we're told is, and by the time you hear this, you perhaps may know what's going to come out of this, but Sanders is going to hold a press conference with like medical personnel around him. The backstory is, and we reported on this at the time, that Deion has spent some time away from the Colorado program this year. He has recently posted on social media that he's excited to be back and things like that. But for a while, Deion was not with the team for at the time what I thought was kind of a unannounced medical issue. Looking at this more deeply, and I believe I have this correct. I want to be careful how I believe that Deion has dealt with some blood clots in the past. I don't know if that's what he's dealing with right now, but there is a medical past for Deion involving some blood clots. So maybe this is what's kind of returned here right now. And we don't know, at least I don't, what Deion's going to say here today. But the fact that he will be having a press conference with medical people around him does at least raise some eyebrows. It could be nothing more than an explanation of why he's missed and now he's back and ready to go charging full steam ahead, or it could be something other than that. We'll be watching that closely from Deion Sanders here today. Now, let me give you two final stories here for a moment. And let me set up both these stories by saying this. One of the things that makes me a good bit different than some of you, like we're almost all Georgia fans here. We have non-Georgia fans that tune in, but this is a show, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. So when it comes to Georgia football, many of us sort of see the world in a very similar way. There is one thing, though, that kind of makes me different, and there are people who are like me, but there are others of you who are not. I am more pro-SEC than some of y'all are. Some of you are very clear. I don't care about anybody in the SEC other than Georgia. The only thing that I care about is whether or not Georgia wins or loses. The rest of the SEC can go pound sand as far as I'm concerned. Many of you would sort of say that's kind of reflects your point of view. I understand feeling that way, but I will tell you that historically I have felt a little bit differently. I do have a sense of regional pride. And to the extent that the SEC, the Southeastern Conference, has represented my region of the country, I have liked the SEC for that reason. My favorite sporting event's always been the SEC championship game. My favorite sport to follow are SEC sports. I just take a lot of pride in, down here in the South, what we've produced when it comes to the SEC. And I would never pretend to be able to tell you what to think. I wouldn't suggest that I should be able to. I certainly wouldn't pretend that it would work if I tried to. But let me humbly suggest that maybe if you haven't exactly taken a certain degree of SEC pride, if the conference at large doesn't matter much to you, maybe you should reconsider that for a couple of reasons I'm about to share. Because when we think about the ongoing battle between the SEC and the Big Ten, it's not just different regions and different kinds of football. I do believe that there are worldviews that are on display with some of this kind of stuff. And that if the Big Ten, quote unquote, wins this battle with the SEC, to the extent there can be a winner in this, if the Big Ten were to win, the version of college football that we would be left with is far different than the alternative would be if the SEC wins. If you want college football to exist as you've largely known it, I do believe your best chance for that is for the SEC to be reigning supreme as the top conference in college football. Let me very quickly give you two stories that I think point out to why. Did you see on Friday, it was announced in the 2026 season, Michigan is going to open the year against Western Michigan in Germany. Now, the cynical-minded person may say, well, given the fact that you've got the, Connor Stalions, sign-stealing controversy still hanging over Michigan, perhaps this trip is their acknowledgement that they're going to have a postseason ban in 2026. So therefore, they at least want to take a trip somewhere. I don't know if that's true, but the cynical among us might say that. There's also, I guess, a little bit of a lot of Michiganders would sort of trace their heritage back to the Germanic people. So, maybe there's some sort of, kind of ready-made reason related to that for why, they're going to play the game in Germany. But for most people, this just seems like a dumb thing to do. Michigan versus Western Michigan in Germany, a country that could care less about the Big Ten or less about college football at all. They're just not into that whatsoever. But here's what we do know. In the NFL, there is a gigantic push for international games, so much so that we're either at the verge of, if not already happening, every NFL team playing at least one international game per season. The NFL is greatly committed to international football games. The Big Ten seemingly is greatly committed to looking as much like the NFL as possible. Its employees, conference officials, head coaches, whatever, they leave to go to the NFL. Other NFL guys come into the Big Ten. The Big Ten just sort of thinks of itself as NFL light. And if the Big Ten were to have its opportunity, my guess is they would play more international games because they copy the NFL, and that's what the NFL does. I think there's also a little bit of a thought here about, and I've talked about this plenty before, that if you think about the future of media rights contracts kind of involving streamers, Netflix, Apple, Amazon, the major players there, y'all, if you look at the kind of content they prefer, they are platforms kind of pursuing a global strategy. The sort of sports that they have invested in are sports thus far that have global appeal. College football has zero global appeal. There are, expatriate Americans living overseas. They still like their favorite college football team, but that's a small sliver of the population overall. College football is a uniquely American endeavor. The Big Ten seemingly wants to change that. Michigan going to play a game in Germany. If the Big Ten wins, there will be more of this, and that isn't to anyone's benefit, I don't believe. Here's the second story. I saw Adam Rittenberg, an ESPN writer, the other day talk about his experience at Big Ten Media Days. Do you know at Big Ten Media Days, which just happened, one of the things that the Big Ten does not do that the SEC does, and I guess every other league does, do you know that the Big Ten does not release an order of finish? They don't have the media members who are there vote on who's going to win the league. I'm sorry, Big Ten teams afraid to have, the reputation of some of their teams tarnished by being predicted at the beginning of the season not to be very good. I just think that's just the worst kind of thing a college football league can do. The Big Ten seems to take pride in doing it. So much so that what Rittenberg, the ESPN writer, who's very closely connected to a lot of these Midwestern type schools, so much so that what Rittenberg wrote this week is that there are a bunch of folks within the Big Ten that would also like to do away with the preseason top 25 polls. And Rittenberg, in his post on X, made it seem like he'd be in favor of this too. So once again, if you let the Big Ten win, say goodbye to the top 25 polls to begin the season, which may sound like not that big of a deal. And in Rittenberg's case, he says, hey, the preseason polls are a problem. It always amazes me how much people who spend their entire life covering college football sort of fail to see some, sort of obvious things sometimes. That in actuality, and there's been stuff written about this, some of the math nerds write this kind of stuff too, that in terms of predictive powers, the preseason poll is better than the other polls throughout the year. That within the sort of week-to-week advancement of the AP poll, for instance, all you really get is the teams that win move up, the teams that lose move down. So you have a lot of like recency bias and in some cases confirmation bias that kind of bleed into those sort of week-to-week rankings. But if you want to see true like wisdom of crowds and actual predictive powers, especially by the time you get to the end of the season, bettors know this works during bowl season. The preseason AP poll has incredible power for that. But nonetheless, the Big Ten wants to do away with it because it's too much fun for a league that, the NFL has been described as the NFL no fun league. it sounds like if the Big Ten were to have its way, it would do away with another thing that a lot of fans view as fun. And I know we're not in a BCS age anymore. AP and coaches poll have no official ramifications on who plays for the championship. But y'all, I can tell you this as someone who kind of pays attention to web traffic and things like that. The weekly polls, when they are announced, people love that stuff, even still. It's the kind of thing that the average college football fan really enjoys. I can tell you my son's 13. All he talks about during the fall is, well, if so-and-so wins, how far they're going to move up, and if so-and-so loses, could they fall out of the poll? That's the way that sort of regular folks consume college football. That's the sort of thing that the Big Ten and the writers who are kind of, at the, very accessible, let me just put it that way, to the Big Ten people, that's the sort of world they would push for. So whether it be international games or no more top 25s, the stuff that makes college football, if you want more of that, you need to root for the SEC to win this sort of battle right now. And if you want college football to truly become NFL Junior and all the things that make that league at times feel antiseptic, a little bit boring, and just a little too corporatized, the Big Ten's your league if that's what you want. And we'll see which of these leagues gets the upper hand in the near future. And for now, we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, I am not in favor of international games when it comes to college football, but international travel, the likes that some of you enjoy during this time of year, well, I'm thrilled to see you enjoying that. And frankly, I enjoy living vicariously through you. After all I do is stay in this box that we call a studio. So in light of that, let me give a golden shoe out today. I think this is really amazing. Our guy Jeff Sintel recently took his family on a vacation to Norway. Jeff also spent some time with us on our recent commitment special for Caden Prothrow and Ty Green. He joined us from Norway for that. Speaking of Norway, one of our DawgNation Daily listeners and viewers sharing this with us, his name's Gary Marks. I'm going to give Gary a golden shoe because, as he writes, I just finished hiking Bergen, Norway in these sweet shoes. And what it is a Georgia-themed sneaker. Very cool to see. He says, while thinking about the great work of DawgNation and international correspondent Jeff Sintel, who obviously also recently joined us from Norway. Gary, what an amazing thing. That's awesome. What a great trip. I mean, you talk about I've never been to Europe. There are parts of Europe when you see these photos, they are just gorgeous. I mean, it just sort of belongs to a different age almost. Just gorgeous. You love to see it. Gary got a chance to experience that firsthand. We'll give him a golden shoe for that. Outstanding stuff. And a great shout out to Jeff Sintel, who was also recently there in Norway. So you love that. Lousy, stinking Gators, you don't love them, but you do love saying this, 1,724 days. That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. That's our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And on video time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews is the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. All right, get some of your comments here today. I'm going to start on Facebook. Say hello to them, and then we'll sort of get everybody else here too. Not going to go one of our crazy long ones today. We actually have a little bit of a meeting we're going to take care of a little bit later on, so I'm going to look forward to doing that. And then we'll see how everybody's doing. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you want to kind of weigh in on some of what we talked about related to, what would be considered a success for Georgia this season, we'll let you do that, or anything else from the show today. We'll give you a chance on all of that. I was going to pull up Facebook first, but Facebook's a little slow to load here right now. So let me instead pop over here to the YouTube side of things. Then we'll get Facebook here in just a moment. Yeah, let's get some of these here right now. On YouTube here just for a moment. Considered a success for Georgia this season. Anonymous Handle checks in to say, says my audio was dropping out a little bit 5 to 7 minutes ago. Gosh, I'm sorry to hear that. Hopefully that wasn't too much of a thing. I wonder what that was about. I apologize for that. I also feel like I don't know. By the way, something we haven't really talked about too much yet, Spencer Clark on the subject of the pre-snap stuff related to the defense. Maybe we should have done that today since we talked so much about defense. Probably need to talk about this at some point in time. The fact they're now going to kind of create sort of a defensive delay of game type thing, defense, drawing the opposing offense off sides, basically inducing a false start would now be a penalty because of, as in Kirby Smart went into this whole thing about, the so-called abrupt movement. I cannot tell you how much I hate this. I just really do. And I think my question would be, the offense already knows the snap count. How many advantages does the offense need? I mean, like that, and, I sort of sound like, a former defensive coach or defensive player when I say that. I'm not a former player of any kind. And I guess I'm like anybody else. When I watch a football game, I'm typically thinking about offense. That's just what fans sort of do. I'm probably not that different than the average person on that. But at the same time, like, how many advantages does the offense need? To the point where, do we literally, because the sort of stimming stuff and things like that Georgia might do, this is an attempt to allow a coaching point, some sort of strategic exercise to make the talent on the field even better. And if you're going to prevent defensive players from doing this, to me, that would be akin of eliminating, say, pre-snap motion from the offense. Because when you send a wide receiver in motion, or when you kind of move around the formation before you snap, I mean, listen, you can go back to a time like, say, the 1960s, the 1970s, where, the defensive coach would be saying, well, how come we can't just line up and play football? Why do we got to do all this dancing around before the ball is snapped? How come we can't just line up and play football? But obviously, that seems like a very antiquated thing to say now, in light of the fact that offensive coaches get their strategic advantage from how they move guys around. You can sort of tell a good coach from a not quite so good coach, I think, sometimes based on the sort of pre-snap motion that you see. It would be, like a dinosaur take to say there should be no pre-snap motion. Well, when it comes to the sort of stemming stuff and the kind of moving around, even like right before the snap, if the offense can do all this stuff prior to getting set, how come the defense can't do that? I mean, I'd love to have somebody sort of explain that to me, because what we sometimes hear is, don't be doing all that gimmicky stuff, just line up and play football. But should there be no role for coaching in this? I mean, it's one of those things where I just don't get it. I don't get it. And I guess obviously some of this kind of comes from the thought that, hey, maybe it might hurt my favorite team more so than others. That's probably true. I can't stand – look, the officiating is not very good. So to give them one more thing they have to make a judgment call on, what is that going to do to the pace of play, just the overall quality of the flow of the game? What is that going to do to that when the officials, who already make just one series of erroneous judgments after another, all of a sudden now they've got one more judgment call to make of whether or not so-and-so move was abrupt, whether it kind of drew certain player in the false start? Because I tell you, every one of these offensive linemen are all going to start that pointing thing. So-and-so drew me off sides. I can't stand all of that. It's going to be awful. And the same way that, the NFL has been ruined by the judgment calls related to, all the ways in which, say, roughing the passer is enforced. Just awful. I mean, it's just so frustrating. And I don't even care if you don't have a vested interest in who wins the game. The flow of the game is interrupted, which is the thing that people hate. It's one of the reasons why they don't call holding very much, is because the only people who want to see holding called are the fans of the defense on the field. Nobody else really wants holding to be called, because holding interrupts the flow of the game. It's also to the benefit of the offense, as I said before. But the average viewer tuning in wants to see a free-flowing game. They essentially want the officials to disappear. So this is going to hurt the flow of the game as another way of kind of padding the offense, which seems unnecessary. Jonathan Aaron wondering if we're going to take the red food coloring this time, or the chicken out again. Yeah, I don't know about that. That's funny, Jonathan, and a fun blast from the past. Let's see what else. Jack Fullerton says, Michigan playing in Germany, I'm getting nauseous. Yeah, I mean, it's just inexplicable. I mean, look, if Georgia played a game in Germany, I'm sure there'd be some Georgia fans kind of looking, one time for sort of once in a lifetime trip. That's not the end of the world, possibly. But, things in sports oftentimes are not limited. That once, because it started off, Notre Dame's going to play a game in Ireland, but they are the Fighting Irish. If anybody made sense playing a game in Ireland, Notre Dame doing so kind of makes some sense. Well, now it's, so-and-so's going to play in Germany, and I've heard talk of so-and-so playing in Brazil or playing in, Mexico. There have been college games in Mexico. I mean, it's just like, everything becomes mission creep after a while. And no, it is to no one's benefit. And yes, you should be against this. And all of this comes from the same place. All of these things to corporatize college football all come from the Big Ten. They just do. When the SEC talks about expansion, it talks about North Carolina, the only southern state, the only southeastern state that doesn't currently have an SEC presence, one that touches Tennessee and South Carolina and Georgia and other SEC states. If you're going to expanding to North Carolina just makes sense. When the Big Ten talks about expansion, they're talking about, essentially being in all 4 time zones and going to play games in Germany. And folks, that just ain't college football. It's just not. And so therefore you should be rooting for the Big Ten's demise. I believe it is in your vested interest to root for the SEC to succeed, because the SEC not only carries a flag for itself, it sort of represents everything else that college football can be. Jeremy Harbin says he thinks the audio issue was a YouTube issue and not on our end. Either way, I'm sorry that it happened. Let me just say it that way. Let me check in at DawgNation.com here for a moment. Let us see what's going on at DawgNation.com. Did Facebook ever come up? Let's see about that. I will tell you that we'll also, like I said before, we've got some stuff we got to do today. We're not going to be able to stay here forever today on this. Also having some problems today a little bit too. Let's get a couple of comments here. Boy, the platforms don't really want to work today, do they? Oh, goodness gracious. All right. Let me go back to YouTube because that's the one that seems to be working the best right now. Sorry, y'all. Let me get a few more here. By the way, Kenneth Holt mentioned the new Happy Gilmore movie. Boy, there was so much chatter about that Happy Gilmore movie over the weekend. Listen, I'm a 90s kid, so Happy Gilmore meant a lot to a lot of the people, of my age bracket for sure. I just could not believe that every single person en masse seemed to want to make some sort of, review of the Happy Gilmore movie. And Kenneth Holt says, it really makes fun of these people that want to change the rules of the game to make sports flashy and appealing to low-interest viewers. Yeah, I mean, and I think some of that's what this is. And look, the UFC president, Dana White, the other day, they've had their pay-per-view package with ESPN. The sports business industry seems to be of the belief that's about to change. And one of the things that White said the other day was, he said, hey, we are looking forward to a partnership in the future with a true global brand. He said something to the effect of that. That's what Dana White said. And I think y'all got to keep that in mind. It's one of the reasons why, and listen, I've had high-powered executives essentially laugh at me for saying this, but I'm not going to stop saying it. There are people who believe, well, the media rights package for college football in the future, because of its popularity in America, it could be 2 or 3 times what it is now in the future. I don't believe that's true. I really don't. And there's nobody more pro college football than I am. Nobody more pro college football than I am. But I don't believe that the media rights future for college football is as high as some people seem to think it is, because we're moving into a world in which television, I'm talking about actual television, cable, over-the-air broadcast, it's about to have a lot less influence than it once did. In fact, it's about to go away maybe altogether. So much so that ESPN this fall is going to be offering, for the very first time, its product as a standalone service. Never happened before. It's going to do that here this year. Y'all, the thing that has made college football so much money, in one respect, as far as I'm concerned, is television's desperate need to stay relevant. college football is a huge draw for ESPN, for CBS, for Fox. And so therefore, I would say in some cases, maybe these networks have almost overspent for it. So much so that ESPN has had to sell off some of its college football playoff games. They sold a semifinal game for this year to TNT. The price has gotten so expensive that ESPN is like looking to recuperate some of what they've spent, even though, the college football playoff is one of the things that keeps ESPN relevant. It's gotten almost so expensive that you can't even really justify it anymore. Nobody's more pro college football than me, but sometimes I wonder if there isn't at some point a media rights bubble that's going to burst, because the future of sports media rights is streaming. Streamers like global content. NFL, NBA, they are quite global. Major League Baseball, to a degree, is pretty global. Shohei Ohtani's Japanese, for instance. A lot of players come from Latin America. There's a certain global appeal to Major League Baseball. Certainly soccer has extensive global appeal. College football has none. College football is not a global sport. There is nowhere in the world where they do anything similar connecting sports to school. Oxford University doesn't have, a football team, for instance. They don't tie sports with school in other parts of the world the way we do here. They just don't. College football's appeal is uniquely American. That doesn't make it a bad thing. I think it makes it a good thing. I think it's nice when countries have their own thing. I don't think every country needs to be the same. This is what makes America America. But if you try to make it like the other professional sports that have essentially sold out a portion of their domestic audience as an attempt to make themselves more appealing to a global audience, boy, I think in the case of college football, that would be destined to fail miserably. Let us see what else. Frederick Meredith says if Georgia ever gets to the point under Kirby where they can't reel in elite talent on the offensive and defensive lines, he's out of here. I promise you that. Yeah, perhaps that's the case. I mean, like the one thing that I will say, though, is kind of going back to a topic that we addressed a little earlier, which is that what counts as elite just may be a little different than it once was. That elite as measured by the talent level in 2021, 2022, well, that may not quite be what it once was. It just might not be. But elite compared to the rest of college football in the current age, well, that overall might just be a little bit different. And we said this with the defensive line going back to last week, which is it seems like Georgia's scouting and its ability to kind of identify sort of diamond in the rough type talents, it seems like that really works, pretty well for a lot of positions. I don't know how that works for the defensive line overall. I just don't. Then when it comes to line of scrimmage stuff like what you're referencing, that's one of those things where, hey, the only way to really succeed is to sort of get the best of the best. And I do think that becomes the sort of thing for Georgia to figure out, especially with Kirby Smart sort of acting as his own GM. And we like the fact that Kirby, has that sort of power over the program. We think that's probably a good thing. But that's the sort of thing that a GM would figure out of how do we make sure we have the right kind of funds to go out and get the players at the most scarce positions while also making sure we've got plenty of talent elsewhere. I think that's probably the case. But the overall talent level would probably seem to be, for the very best teams, probably seem to be regressing at least somewhat. Although it's fair to point out that when it comes to things like, say, Bud Elliott's blue chip ratio, that's not exactly measurably true for college football right now. Probably fair to point that out. Tennille says it means the world to me that you showcase my hat. Yeah, so what Tennille made years ago are the Facebook top fan hats. And yeah, I do. I showcase that at my house. One of these days, I'm working to get a better display of a lot of the stuff that y'all have given me. A lot of that is at home. I don't quite have room for as much of that here. And at some point in time, just have a great display of all that kind of stuff and sort of showcase a lot more of that. So many of you have been so kind, including Tennille, who years ago, the same way you get these like crown things on, although I don't know that I see the crowns today, on YouTube. Yeah, the crowns are here. Facebook was doing this thing for a while called Top Fan Badge. And so Tennille made these hats for that. It's a really cool thing. And Miriam Corbin made hats one time. I've got Miriam's hat, Tennille's hat. So many of you have made so many things for me, and I just really appreciate that over the years. I really do. Let's see what else. Mark Woodmansee says he needs some real college football like crazy. Yeah, I think a lot of us sort of feel that way, kind of ready for that for sure. The start of the college football season, not too far away now. We know that fall camp's on its way. So what Georgia reports, I guess, Wednesday, you'll have Kirby Smart speaking on Thursday. And that's always a pretty important press conference. It's a little bit different than what you kind of think of with the Media Days press conference. The Media Days press conference is sort of determined by those who get to ask questions. And a lot of the folks who get called on are not Georgia-centric people that are doing that sort of thing. So what you end up with is it's just sort of a different crop of questions. And so sometimes, you know, it almost ends up being just a little bit bland because the kinds of questions that get asked. But when it comes to the press conference for this week with Kirby Smart, this will be a very football-centric, hardcore issues, injury updates. Think about, like, say, Roderick Robinson on that, some of the other guys that missed spring practice. Now, it'll be Kirby's prerogative of how much of that he actually kind of reveals, what he chooses to say, what he doesn't. But it's a lot more hardcore Georgia. So it's a really fun press conference coming. Then after that, we'll get, you know, I would say probably weekly updates from Kirby until kind of like game week. I mean, like, really and truly, the news cycle is about to really pick up in a way that probably, you know, hasn't been true. Billy Cloud on the subject of the edge rush position. So we played for you earlier, High Parade. This is on Facebook. Elo Modozie from Cole Kublik. I definitely think Elo's in the mix here. I don't know that I'm ready to say defensive player of the year. That seems like a lot to me. But, you know, Cole's a smart football analyst, so we'll take his words on that pretty seriously. But Elo's in the mix. Gabe Harris, I think, I'm always going to have a little bit of a bias, not in terms of a preference, but just in terms of an expectation, a little bit of a bias in favor of those who've been here. Harris has been here. I think that Harris is a pretty sharp talent overall. So I definitely think that both kind of a hybrid type thing, defensive end, edge rusher, stand-up outside linebacker. I mean, I'm expecting some pretty big things from Gabe Harris this year too. Joseph Kennedy says he's listening to Ozzy Osbourne music all day. Boy, you love that. Still thinking back to the life and legacy of Ozzy Osbourne. So many great ones kind of taken from us the last few days. By the way, got a Greg Talley reference in the comment section. You love doing that. Ken Holcomb bringing up a good point that as we're sailing in the Tennessee River with our riverboat, be careful, much like the iceberg with the Titanic, goalpost in that Tennessee River, got to make sure we kind of navigate around that. Maybe I'll be up in the crow's nest with some binoculars, kind of looking to make sure we don't hit anything like that. Perhaps that'll be the case, Kent. That's very funny. Very funny stuff indeed. And to this day, I still don't understand. You know, the only redeemable part of Knoxville is the Tennessee River. I mean, if that place didn't have the river, Knoxville would be not, I'll be kind here, try to maintain a good witness. Knoxville would not be a very pleasant place to visit if not for the Tennessee River. So the fact you take the one thing, I mean, Alabama wrote a song about it, for goodness sakes. You take the group, not the university. Take the one thing about your town that's actually kind of pleasant. Everybody would think the Tennessee River is pretty. It's a pretty thing. And then you pollute it with the goalpost after you beat Alabama in 2022. Jacob O'Neill also warning about flying mustard bottles. Indeed, that's the case. You got to be careful with that. Very funny comments. All right. I am having major computer problems today, so I just don't know if I'm going to be able to get on DawgNation.com. Certainly trying to. Don't know if we're going to be able to pull that off. Let me come back over to say hello to our YouTube folks one more time, and then we'll get ready to go for today. By the way, don't forget, it's On the Beat coming up a little bit later on tonight. Interesting stuff with Mike Griffith and Cody Chafin, so I'll have that for you. Georgia also looking ahead to this weekend, perhaps of adding another commitment. kind of excited about that, Anthony. Yeah, so as a guest tonight, Coach Mark Richt, the great Georgia legend, ACC network analyst now, going to join in with Mike and Cody. So that should be a lot of fun, sharing some thoughts on kind of what's next for Georgia and all that kind of stuff. That coming with Mark Richt. I said we're also looking ahead to the weekend where Anthony Lonnan gets ready to make his decision. That should be a fun thing to watch. And you got a lot getting ready to go down as I tap dance here while I just deal with some computer issues. You know what? That's it. I'm done.
I'll give you one to bat around. You want some? Braves are going to break a positive record. They just announced most attended regular season game. They're going to have 85,000 people at the Bristol game.
Okay, so that's fun. You know, I can't imagine that. I can't imagine that the crowd at Bristol Motor Speedway is going to be. Sight lines are really important for baseball, and I would imagine the sight lines on that are going to probably be pretty terrible if I had to guess, right? I mean, I think that's probably true. However, I think it's cool they're doing it. I think stuff like that, kind of one-off, is kind of fun. Like the Field of Dreams game they did, is probably the most fun thing I've seen. I don't know that anything quite, compares to that. But I will tell you this, in what has been just a moribund season for the Braves, y'all, the attendance is still really good. And, this is something I think about kind of a lot. Like a lot of you are Georgia fans, but you have no real connection to Atlanta. So if you have no connection to Atlanta, this doesn't mean much to you. But I am old enough to remember when Atlanta sort of had a bad reputation as kind of a bad sports town. You may remember this. And I would say there is perhaps a time in which maybe that was true. Maybe Atlanta was kind of a bad sports town, not selling out playoff games, things like that. If that were ever true, perhaps at one point in time it was, I think you have to say that now that's not really true anymore, that Atlanta has become a really good sports town. Case in point, y'all, the Braves attendance is always outstanding. I'm talking about like day games when it's really hot. Even this season, what is really a lost season, the Braves are. I mean, they're atrocious. They have just we suggested this the other day that, you kind of worried about the bottom falling out. Well, the bottom has fallen out, but people still go to these games, man. And I wasn't so sure about the Battery when it's first kind of, brought to life, but I think it's been a game changer in the sports scene. The Falcons have been drawing huge crowds for their training camp practices. The passion of Atlanta sports fans, I would say, is kind of right now on par with anywhere. And I think one of the things that happens is that when I was a kid, the prevailing voices in the media were people who were old enough, kind of pre-1960s, to remember when Atlanta was not a pro sports town. So Atlanta, as a pro sports town, just like 20 or 30 years into its existence, felt in the eyes of like very older people a little bit of an imposter. Well, now the prevailing voice in the media are people who have only been alive in a time in which Atlanta's had pro sports. So I think the way in which Atlanta gets talked about as a sport town is just different than it used to be. But certainly, I mean, the passion for the Braves remains incredibly high. And so I cannot really give the franchise itself much credit for anything right now. But Braves fans, as good as ever. Braves fans are as good as ever.
Baseball in attendance this year, averaging 37,000.
How much?
Seventh in baseball, averaging 37,000.
So seventh in attendance for the season in a year where they're nowhere close to having the seventh best record. I would say that's a pretty good thing. All right, a couple of final comments and we're going to get ready to go. KC says the Falcons' problem is they overpaid Kirk Cousins. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a good bit of excitement with that team, but the benefit you get from a quarterback on a rookie contract is money to spend elsewhere. Falcons obviously, hurt that because they've got this money tied up into Kirk Cousins. That's a little bit of a circus sideshow. I don't deny that. But I think the overall optimism for Atlanta's, whether warranted or not, is pretty high here right now. Anonymous Handle says he's got Dale Murphy's rookie card. So Murphy had, technically speaking, 2 cards that were listed as a rookie. His first Topps card was one of those 4-face cards back in 1977. He also had another one of those in 78 too, right? I never had the Murphy rookie, but when I was a kid, I used to kind of look longingly at those who did, because that was obviously, basically from before I was born. But I remember back then they put a lot of the rookies in these sort of four-face cards because, hey, one of these rookies is likely to be good, then the cards may be worth something. But the rookies back then weren't sort of thought as being worthy of having their own card, which is obviously very different than it is now. But the 77 Topps Murphy, I do remember that very well. By the way, our buddy Bo Molinari says the Atlanta still has a Falcons problem. Maybe so. Jack Fullerton says in a stadium, you can see the ball, but I would say you can't see the player. I mean, for the people who saw Tennessee play Virginia Tech at Bristol a few years ago, they'll tell you it's hard to see anything. I mean, if you've never been to a NASCAR race or just any kind of race, they had NASCAR at the Brickyard this past weekend. If you've never been to a NASCAR race, I think the thing that you would be overwhelmed by is how big the track is. Indy's 2.5 miles, Daytona's 2.5 miles, Atlanta, or Echo Park as it's known as now, 1.5 miles. And what that means is that if you're expecting a football stadium, when you go to a big outdoor venue, you think football stadium. But tracks are far bigger than football stadiums, including like a 1/2 mile thing like Bristol. It's still way bigger than a football stadium because, that's a larger circumference than what a typical football stadium has. So, you are just way removed from the action. It's elevated and stuff like that, but you're just sort of way removed from all of that. All right. What else? Anything else before we go? We're getting ready to wrap it up here for today. By the way, KC says both Murphy and Jones should be in the Hall of Fame. Yeah, I think the case for both of them is really strong. I really do. And I think the way in which Atlanta was once perceived as a sports town has a great impact on the reason why Murphy and Jones are not in the Hall of Fame. And I'll be honest with you. I think the lack of prominent voices offering a defense of Atlanta in the past has played into the way in which Atlanta sports has been perceived. If you go back and look at, for those of you who are like, not everybody cares about sports media, but if you do care about sports media, go back and think of, for instance, like the heyday of like Bob Ryan as columnist for the Boston Globe. Bob Ryan was basically a cheerleader for Boston sports. And, Boston sports always had sort of a level of respect for the national media that for a long time Atlanta sports had a hard time getting. I would say that the Boston sports media also amplified that by doing a good job of propping up their own. I think, and a lot of this predates me, and most of this sort of predates most of the people working in the media right now. But I do think that Murphy should have had his career amplified better. I do. I think that, Andrew Jones hurt a little bit by the fact that, sometimes he was kind of at odds with Bobby Cox. Cox removed him from a game. Jones probably only had the one true MVP level season. It's like the old cliche of he was a compiler. Some of the Andrew Jones offensive numbers were just sort of compiled over a long period of time. But, he's among the greatest defensive center fielders of all time. Defense, of course, matters. His offensive stats are really good for someone who was as good defensively as he was, and he did almost win an MVP, even if he came up just short. So I think the case for both Murphy and Jones is better than it's given credit for, and I do think Atlanta would be served well by having big, loud voices having made that case more aggressively over the years. I do think that's would be true. And I do think both Murphy and Jones would have been in the Hall of Fame if that had been the case. So we'll leave it with that for today. More comments coming tomorrow as we get ready for the start of fall camp. A lot of fun. And we'll continue to kind of look at kind of where Georgia stacks up as it relates to all that. Y'all check out R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised. The price is promised. You can trust them on all of that today, including getting your air conditioning unit tuned back up to factory fresh specs. Always great on that. Keep you staying cool and comfortable during this very hot summer, including very hot weather today. Our friends at R.S. Andrews have got you on that. So find them online, rsandrews.com. We are back tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then.